A lone farmer. Two young orcs lost in the biting cold of winter, a hungry wolf between them and their lives. In seconds, it could have all ended, but he fired. The next day, the mother arrived with a reward no one expected. The wind cut across the frozen plains, like a blade with no handle, sharp, indifferent, and impossibly cold. Thomas Carr rode alone, his breath rising in pale clouds that dissolved before they reached the grey sky above. 5 years had passed since the peace treaty between humans and orcs, but out here, on the edge of the frontier, that paper might as well have been written in disappearing ink. The tension still lived in the land itself, in the way ranchers locked their gates at dusk and orcs moved in small, cautious groups through the tall grass. Thomas had no group, just his horse, a worn rifle slung across his back, and the kind of silence that fills the chest of a man who has spent too many winters alone. His ranch sat 2 miles east, modest, functional, and almost entirely empty of warmth. He kept it running out of habit more than hope. He was halfway home when he heard it. A thin cry, barely human, barely anything. High and trembling and cut short by a sound far more dangerous, a low, wet growl that rolled across the snow like a warning. Thomas pulled the reins. His horse stiffened beneath him. He scanned the white landscape until his eyes found what didn't belong. 2 small figures pressed against an outcrop of rock, hunched together like one creature trying to make itself disappear. He nudged the horse forward slowly. They were orcs, young ones, children. Their skin was a vivid, brilliant green, the kind of color that didn't apologize for existing, and their pointed ears trembled, whether from cold or terror he couldn't yet tell. Their clothes were thin leather and worn fur, nowhere near enough for a night like this. They clutched each other with locked arms and wide, dark eyes, and between them and Thomas, crouched low with spine curving and teeth bared to the gumline, was a wolf. It was lean and furious with hunger. Its ribs showed beneath matted grey fur. Its eyes were pale and fixed entirely on the 2 small figures against the rock, tracking the tiniest movements of their trembling bodies. It hadn't noticed Thomas yet, or it didn't care. Thomas didn't think. He raised the rifle with one smooth motion, steadied his breath the way his father had taught him before his father stopped teaching him anything at all, and fired. The wolf dropped without a sound. Snow scattered. The echo of the shot rolled out across the plains and vanished into nothing. For a long moment, no one moved. The 2 children stared at the fallen wolf, then up at Thomas, then at each other, their chests heaving in short, desperate pulls of icy air. Thomas lowered the rifle slowly, keeping his posture as still and unthreatening as a man on horseback could manage. He didn't speak, didn't reach forward. Just let the silence settle back down around them like snow, finding its level after a disturbance. The younger one, smaller, rounder-faced with 2 tiny tusks barely visible beneath her lip, blinked at him. Something moved across her expression that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite trust. Something in between, studying him the way a creature studies fire, drawn to the warmth, uncertain of the burn. Thomas looked out across the plains. The light was already going grey at the edges. The temperature would drop 10 more degrees before midnight. He looked back at the children, then down at the dead wolf, then at the darkening sky. Whatever those 2 were waiting for hadn't come, and the night was not going to be kind about it. He slid down from the horse and crouched in the snow, making himself smaller, and waited for them to decide. The younger one moved first. She detached from her sister's grip with the cautious deliberateness of someone who had been warned many times not to trust strangers, but had decided, in this particular moment, to override that warning entirely. She crossed the short distance between them in small, crunching steps through the snow, and then, before Thomas could register what was happening, she closed her small green fingers around the sleeve of his coat and held on. Her grip was stronger than made any sense for a child her size. Thomas looked at the older one. She stood rigid against the rock, arms crossed over her chest, jaw set, watching him with eyes that measured everything and gave away nothing. She was perhaps 11 or 12, he guessed, old enough to understand danger in a way her sister wasn't yet. She didn't move toward him, but she didn't move away either. After a moment, she gave a single short nod, as though she had reached a private verdict and was informing him of the result. He got back on the horse, settled the younger girl across the saddle in front of him, and started the slow ride back toward the ranch. The older one walked alongside in complete silence, close enough to the horse to keep pace, far enough to make clear she was choosing to follow and not being led. The younger girl, he didn't know her name yet, kept her fingers locked around his sleeve the entire way. When the ranch came into view, a low square of dim yellow light against the dark plain, he felt her grip ease slightly. Not enough to let go, just enough to mean something. Inside, he built the fire up fast and high. He brought out everything he had that could pass for a meal: a pot of bean stew from 2 days ago, a half loaf of stale bread he broke into pieces, and a thin broth he warmed from the bones of a chicken he'd roasted the week before. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and hot was what they needed. The younger one ate without hesitation, hunched close to the fire, both small hands wrapped around the bowl, as though afraid someone would take it. Between each bite, she looked up at Thomas with quick, direct glances, eyes that tracked his hands, his posture, the distance between him and the door, not afraid, exactly, calculating. She was deciding something, slowly, bite by bite. The older one ate differently. She kept her eyes down and her movements precise and controlled, the kind of eating that comes from practice at not appearing vulnerable. She cleaned the bowl completely without once looking at him, and when she finished, she set it down exactly where she'd found it. Thomas sat on the other side of the fire and didn't ask questions. He knew enough about the frontier and its history to understand that children traveling alone in freezing weather, without supplies or visible protection, did not come from a story that had gone well. He would learn the pieces in time, or he wouldn't. Either way, they were here and they were warm, and that was the immediate problem solved. He gave them the 2 blankets from his chest, the ones he kept folded for guests he never had, and pointed toward the cot near the wall. The older one arranged them precisely and lay down with her back to the room, facing the wall. The younger one curled at the foot of the cot, with one blanket pulled tight around her shoulders and her eyes still open, watching the fire. Thomas sat in his chair, with his boots still on, and kept the fire going through the night. Somewhere in the small hours, he heard the younger one's breathing slow and deepen. He reached over and gently tucked the edge of the blanket beneath her feet, without waking her. Outside, the wind picked up and threw itself against the walls of the cabin. Inside, for the first time in a long while, the silence felt different. She arrived just after sunrise. Thomas heard the horse before he saw it, a steady, purposeful rhythm through the snow, coming from the northeast. He was already at the window before the figure cleared the tree line, rifle resting across his forearm, not pointed at anything, just present. She rode without hurry, but there was nothing casual about it. The woman sat straight-backed on a dark horse, broad shoulders carrying a faded red blanket draped over them like a cloak. Her hair was pulled into thick braids threaded with small bones and dark crystals that caught the pale morning light and scattered it in fragments. Her face was sharp, high cheekbones, a firm jaw, pointed ears partially obscured by the braids. Her eyes, when they finally found Thomas standing in the doorway, were the color of deep river water before a storm. She stopped the horse at the edge of the yard. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then the cabin door burst open behind Thomas, and both girls came through at a dead run, crashing through the snow without boots, the younger one shrieking something in the Orc language that Thomas didn't know, but understood without translation. The woman dropped from the horse before it fully stopped, landing on both knees in the snow, and she caught them both with her arms and pulled them against her chest with a force that shook her whole body. She didn't make a sound. Her face pressed into the younger girl's hair, then the older girl's shoulder, then back again. Her arms stayed locked around them for a long time. Thomas stayed in the doorway and looked at the middle distance and gave them the moment. When she finally rose, there was snow on her knees and something complicated in her expression. Relief layered over exhaustion, layered over a grief that clearly predated last night. She walked toward him with steady steps, the girls flanking her on either side, each holding one of her hands. She stopped a respectful distance away and looked at him fully. "Thomas Carr," she said. Her accent was thick, but her pronunciation careful, like someone who had learned the language later in life and worked hard to be understood. He nodded slowly. "Jara." One of the girls must have told her his name, or she had asked someone in the area, or she had known before she arrived. He couldn't tell which, and it didn't matter. She spoke in short, deliberate sentences. Her companion had died in the war, the same war the treaty was supposed to have ended. Her clan had fractured in the aftermath, scattered by the pressures that came after peace, the same way some storms are worse after lightning than during it. Without her partner and without the protection of a recognized clan, she and her daughters had been traveling light and cautious for months. She worked in exchange for shelter when she could find it. She kept moving because staying in any one place too long made them visible in ways that attracted the wrong kind of attention. Thomas listened without interrupting. When she finished, she reached into the pouch at her belt and drew out something small and set it carefully on the fence post between them, a carved bone pendant, simple and precise, shaped like a running horse. A traveler's token, she explained, a symbol that meant safe passage. In the old agreements, the ones older than the treaty, older than the frontier itself. She was giving it to him not as payment, but as recognition, the kind that meant something. Thomas looked at it for a moment, then looked back at her. "You can stay until the weather breaks," he said. "After that, we'll figure out the next part." She studied him for 2 full seconds before she nodded. Harlan Voss's property began where Thomas's fence line ended, and the division between them had always been more than just wire and wooden posts. Voss had arrived in the region before the treaty, when the frontier rules were written by whoever had the most men and the least hesitation. He had built his operation on those rules, and had never fully accepted that the rules had changed. He was wealthy, well-connected in the nearest town, and careful enough to keep his worst practices 1 or 2 steps removed from anything provable. Thomas had known about Voss for years, the way you know about a cracked floorboard in a familiar room. You work around it, you don't push your weight on it, and you try not to think about what's underneath. That calculation changed on the 3rd morning after Jara's arrival. Thomas was mending a section of fence along the property's western edge when he saw 2 riders approaching from the direction of Voss's land. They weren't moving fast. They didn't need to. Men who ride slow towards someone else's fence are usually making a point about who has more time. They stopped just outside the boundary and rested their arms across their saddle horns with the relaxed posture of men who expected the conversation to go a certain way. "Carr," the taller one said. He had a wide, flat face, and the particular kind of smile that doesn't reach any part of it except the mouth. His name, Thomas would learn later, was Bet. 6 years in Voss's service, reliable in the way tools are reliable. He did what he was pointed at and didn't ask what for. "Word is you've got an Orc woman staying at your place, unregistered, no clan documents." "Word travels fast," Thomas said. "It does when people pay attention." Bet tilted his head. "Mr. Voss is a civic-minded individual. He's concerned about the legal situation. An Orc without documentation under a recognized clan could be considered unprotected under the treaty provisions. Which means anyone with the right paperwork could claim, 'I know what it means,'" Thomas said, "and I know which part of the treaty you're quoting and which parts you're leaving out." The second man, shorter and quieter, watched Thomas with flat, patient eyes. He hadn't spoken. He didn't need to. He was the kind of presence that communicates through stillness. "Mr. Voss just wants things done properly," Bet continued. "No trouble. He'd be happy to help facilitate the legal process, take the woman and the children into his, protection, while the paperwork gets sorted. The smile again. Civic-minded. Thomas set down his fence tools with a slow, deliberate movement. He turned to face them fully, and his voice came out calm, the way deep water is calm, nothing churning on the surface, but you wouldn't want to test the bottom. You can tell Mr. Voss that the situation on my property is being handled according to the treaty provisions I'm familiar with. All of them, not the ones he finds convenient. Bet held the smile for another moment, then let it go. You think about it, Carr. Things have a way of getting complicated for people who make the wrong kind of friends out here. They turned their horses and rode back the way they came, unhurried, making that point again with every slow step. Thomas stood at the fence and watched them go. Then he went back to the cabin without mending any more wire, and he sat down with a cup of cold coffee and thought carefully about what was coming and how much time he had before it arrived. That night, Jara didn't sleep. Thomas woke sometime past midnight to find the cabin's interior quiet and the fire burned low. He lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the building, the tick of cooling wood, the distant moan of wind outside, the soft breathing of the two girls wrapped in blankets near the hearth. Then he noticed the shape at the window. Jara sat on the low bench beneath the east-facing window, with her composite bow resting across her knees, strung and ready. She hadn't made a sound. She wasn't moving. Her eyes were fixed on the darkness outside with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent time in places where danger arrives without warning. Thomas got up quietly, pulled a blanket over his shoulders against the cold, and sat down in the chair beside the window. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask her to come away from the post or try to reassure her that everything was fine, because it wasn't. And she would know the lie before it finished leaving his mouth. They sat together in the dark for a long time. The fire behind them faded to embers. The wind outside shifted direction twice. Occasionally, a branch cracked in the cold somewhere in the tree line, and both of them registered it, and both of them waited, and then both of them relaxed the same fraction of an inch when nothing followed. After a while, Thomas said quietly, "The tall one's name is Bet. He's been Voss's man for 6 years. I've seen his kind before, does exactly what he's told and never asks what for. The quiet one beside him worries me more." Jara didn't look away from the window. The quiet one is always more dangerous. Thomas thought about that. "Yeah," he said. "He is." Another silence. Longer this time. "They came for us before," Jara said. Her voice was flat and even, like a statement of weather. "Different place, different men, same offer." She paused. "My companion fought them. That was the night." She stopped. The sentence didn't need an ending. Thomas looked at his hands. "You could go," he said carefully. He wasn't suggesting it, just opening the door so she could close it herself if she wanted. "Take the girls north. There are settlements near the Greystone River where the treaty holds better." She was quiet for a moment. "I know those settlements." Her eyes didn't leave the window. "I spent 4 months there, 2 years ago. The treaty holds, yes, but you still eat alone. You still hear the way people breathe differently when you walk into a room." She shifted slightly. "Running is not the same as being safe." Thomas had no answer for that, because it was completely true. Across the room, Vora murmured something in her sleep and pulled her blanket tighter without waking. Graka's arm shifted and settled. The embers in the fireplace pulsed once with a breath of air from under the door, and then went steady again. Thomas got up and added 2 logs to the fire. He came back to the chair and sat down again. Jara was still at the window, still watching. "I'll take the first watch," she said. "You sleep." "I'm already awake," he said. She looked at him for the first time since he'd sat down. Something passed across her expression, brief and private. Then she turned back to the window. They kept watch together until the sky at the eastern edge of the plain turned a dim, cold grey, and the darkness finally let go of the land. The pressure from Voss didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, the way certain kinds of damage do, quiet and cumulative, each piece small enough to dismiss on its own, large enough to matter when added together. The first piece arrived on a Tuesday morning. Thomas loaded his winter grain into the cart before dawn and made the 2-hour ride to Voss's mill, the same as he had done for 3 years. It wasn't a good arrangement. Voss charged more than the work justified, but it was the only mill within reasonable distance. When he pulled up to the gate, the mill foreman came out to meet him with the expression of a man reading from a script he didn't write. The mill was at capacity. Very sorry. Maybe try again in spring. Thomas sat on the cart for a moment and looked at the foreman, who looked at his own boots. Then Thomas turned the cart around and drove home with his grain and didn't waste energy being surprised. The following week, 2 buyers who had standing agreements to collect cattle from his ranch sent no word and no men. Thomas rode to town to ask why and got the same uncomfortable silence from both of their representatives. Circumstances had changed. They were sorry. No hard feelings. Then came the rumors, delivered second-hand by Hendricks at the general store, a cautious woman who repeated things she'd overheard as warning rather than gossip, that Thomas Carr had gone strange, that there were dangerous animals at his property, that no one ought to do business with him until things got sorted out. Jara came to understand the pattern before Thomas named it aloud. She was watching him one evening as he sat at the table going through his accounts, marking columns that no longer balanced, and she said without ceremony, "He is drawing a circle around you, smaller every week." Thomas looked up. "I have seen this before," she said. She was braiding Vora's hair near the fire, her fingers moving steadily, her eyes on him. "Not with cattle and mills, but the shape is the same. First he takes away the things you rely on. Then he waits for you to become desperate. Desperate people make choices that give him what he wants, without him having to take it." She paused. "He will come when he believes you have nothing left to lose by giving in." Thomas sat back in his chair. "How much time do you think we have?" She considered. "Less than you'd want. More than you'd fear." He nodded slowly. Then he got up and went to the lockbox under the floorboards and counted his remaining ammunition. It wasn't much, but it was something. He put it back, replaced the board, and sat back down at the table. He wrote 3 letters that night, one to a lawyer in the county seat he had met once at a land dispute hearing, one to a former frontier guardian he trusted, and one to the territorial administrator who had overseen the original treaty negotiations. He didn't know if any of them would arrive in time to matter, but Jara had given him the shape of the problem, and now he could work with it. The storm came in from the northwest on a Tuesday night, which Thomas had not expected, and Jara had. She'd been watching the sky since midday, the particular color of clouds that meant snow with intention behind it. And by late afternoon she had quietly moved everything of value away from the window shutters and checked both door bars without being asked. Thomas noticed this the same way he noticed most things she did, slightly after the fact, with the mild surprise of someone realizing the competence around them had been there all along. By the time the snow started falling in earnest, visibility had dropped to 30 feet, and the wind was loud enough to cover the sound of approaching hooves. Which was, Thomas suspected, exactly the point. He was sitting with the rifle across his knees and his back to the far wall when the shapes appeared in the white, 4 of them mounted, with torches that barely held against the wind. They arranged themselves in a loose arc around the front of the property with the practiced spacing of men who had done this before. Thomas stood up and opened the door before they reached the porch. The torchlight picked up the snow between them, millions of falling sparks in the orange glow, and at the center of it stood Thomas with the rifle, and a half step to his right and slightly behind, Jara with the bow already drawn. Behind her, partially framed in the doorway, Graka held a bone-handled knife in a 2-handed grip. her feet planted and her face completely still. The lead rider pulled up. It was Bet, grey coat dusted white with snow, sitting straight in the saddle with the practiced ease of someone who had done this kind of work before and expected it to resolve the same way it always did. He called out over the wind with the loud, neutral voice of a man reading terms. Thomas Carr was harbouring unregistered Orc migrants in violation of the Frontier Settlement Acts, specifically subsection 9 regarding unaffiliated persons of non-human designation. He and his charges had one opportunity to resolve this peaceably. He meant hand them over. Thomas said nothing. He held the rifle in a grip that was neither threatening nor relaxed, which was itself a kind of statement. He was looking at Bet, but from the corner of his eye he could see the other three, and he was watching their hands the way Jara had taught him to, without meaning to teach him. She had simply done it herself, often enough near him that he had learned. No one moved. The torchlight shook in the wind. Snow covered the grey coat, the horses' backs, the flat ground between them. Somewhere on the other side of the standoff, a horse shifted and was stilled. Bet looked at Thomas, then he looked at Jara, then at Graka behind her, young and small and completely steady with the knife. He looked at the rifle. He looked back at Thomas. Whatever calculation he ran in those few seconds came back with an answer that wasn't worth the risk. His jaw tightened. He pulled his horse sideways. The other three followed without a word, and they moved back into the white until the torchlight became a diffuse glow, and then nothing. Thomas lowered the rifle. He heard Jara release a slow, controlled breath beside him. Then he felt something close around his belt, just above the hip. He looked down. Vora had come out of the cabin at some point without anyone noticing. She stood at his side in her blanket and bare feet in the snow, one small hand holding onto the fabric of his coat. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She was looking out at the place where the lights had disappeared with a calm, serious expression that belonged to someone much older. Thomas stared at her for a moment. Then he turned back to the darkness, and the three of them, the man, the woman, and the small girl between them, stood together on the frozen porch until the storm closed over the tracks and the night went quiet again. Thomas found the treaty document in the morning. He had known about the provision for years, Article 14, Section 3, which allowed for the legal registration of non-clan affiliated Orcs as residents under the protection of a recognized human landholder, provided certain documentation requirements were met. It was an obscure clause, buried in the back third of the treaty text, in the kind of dense legal language designed to be ignored. Most people who knew it existed treated it as a technicality with no practical application. Most lawyers in the region had never used it. Thomas had read the treaty through twice in the months after it was signed, because he had land on the frontier and he believed in knowing the rules of the land he lived on, even the rules nobody else bothered with. He spent 2 days completing the paperwork. The forms required a land survey, witness signatures, a sworn declaration of intent, and registration through the territorial office. Thomas filled every line with careful, deliberate handwriting. He asked Hendricks from the general store to witness. She came without hesitation, which surprised him and then didn't, because she had been warning him about Voss through second-hand gossip for a reason. He rode to the territorial office on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the night in the snow. The clerk was young and uncertain and spent a long time with the paperwork in a way that suggested he'd never processed this form before. Thomas waited at the counter without impatience and answered every question fully and correctly, and eventually the stamp came down on the page with a sound like something finally being settled. Jara and her daughters were now registered legal residents of the Carr property under the full protections of Article 14. Voss's subsection 9, the one Bet had cited in the storm, did not apply to registered residents. He had no legal mechanism left. Thomas rode home through the flat, pale light of late afternoon with the documents folded in his coat pocket. Jara read them at the kitchen table, both daughters watching her from either side. Graka read over her shoulder, tracking each word with one finger. Vora waited until Jara finished and then looked up and asked, in the direct way she asked everything, "Does this mean we can stay?" "Yes," Thomas said. "It means you can stay." She nodded once, as if confirming something she had already suspected, and went back to whatever she had been doing before. That night, Thomas sat in his chair by the fire. Vora fell asleep leaning against his arm before the first hour was out, her weight settling gradually until he was more support than furniture. Graka sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing shapes in the packed dirt with a stick. Animals, he thought, or perhaps maps, or both. Jara sat across from him with a cup of something warm, and she was watching him in the quiet way she had developed over the weeks, not studying him for threats anymore, but something slower and more deliberate than that. He thought about the years he had spent in this cabin building walls more carefully than the roof, keeping everything at the specific distance that felt like safety and produced nothing but a very well-maintained silence. He thought about all the ways he had convinced himself that this was enough. He looked at Vora's face, slack and trusting in sleep. At Graka's focused hands in the firelight. At Jara, who had crossed impossible terrain to find her daughters and had not broken, and who was now sitting in his kitchen drinking something warm. Something shifted in his chest, not painfully, the way ice shifts when the temperature finally turns. Spring arrived in the frontier the way it always did, not all at once, but in negotiations. A warm afternoon, followed by 3 cold nights. The first mud, a single flower at the south edge of the fence that had no business being there yet, but had appeared anyway, indifferent to the schedule. Thomas noticed it on a morning in late March when he was walking the property line to check the fence posts after the winter. He stood there looking at it for a moment, then kept walking. Life on the ranch had settled into a shape he hadn't anticipated, but recognized as real. Jara was awake before him most mornings, already in the yard, already moving with that purposeful efficiency that seems to be the default setting of someone who has spent years ensuring their own survival. She had taken over the management of the horses without discussion, because she was better at it, and they both knew it. Graka had, over a period of weeks, migrated from wary observer to reluctant participant to something approaching ownership over the kitchen garden, which she tended with the same controlled intensity she applied to everything. Vora had simply decided, at some point no one could exactly identify, that Thomas was hers, and conducted herself accordingly. Voss remained. He had not come again after the night in the snow. But Thomas heard through Hendricks that Voss had sent letters to the territorial office challenging the registration, citing procedural irregularities that didn't exist and precedents that didn't apply. The territorial office, to its credit, had returned the letters with a single response. The registration was valid and final. Voss had not replied. It was not over, exactly. The word in town was still complicated. There were still people who crossed the street when Thomas walked with Jara and the girls, people who found somewhere else to look. The frontier's invisible borders, the ones written in habit and history rather than ink, didn't disappear because a document said they should. Thomas knew this. Jara had always known it, but the knowing didn't make the present moment smaller. On a Saturday in early April, the 4 of them rode together into town for supplies. Thomas and Jara on horseback, Graka and Vora in the back of the cart. It was the first time since the registration. Thomas kept his posture even and his pace unhurried. Jara rode straight-backed with her braids catching the spring wind, completely composed, acknowledging no one staring and missing nothing. Hendricks met them at the door of the general store and helped them carry the supplies, without once making it a statement, which was, in its quiet way, a statement. On the ride home, Vora leaned over the side of the cart and let her fingers trail through the new grass, beginning to push through at the road's edge. Graka watched the sky with her usual serious attention, cataloguing the clouds the way she catalogued everything, for information, for patterns, for knowledge that might someday matter. Thomas looked at the road ahead, then at Jara riding parallel to the cart, her profile sharp against the pale spring sky. She turned and met his eyes for a moment. Nothing was said, nothing needed to be. Behind them, from somewhere in the direction of Voss's property, a rider appeared on the distant ridge, single figure still, watching. Thomas noted it and looked forward again. He had stopped being afraid of what Voss might do and started thinking about what Voss might try, which was a different and more useful frame. There were still articles in the treaty he hadn't fully mapped, still provisions that remained unused, still work to do. The ranch came into view at the end of the road. Smoke was already rising from the chimney. Graka had jumped down early and run ahead and had apparently decided a fire was needed. It probably wasn't necessary. The afternoon was mild, but it was warm to look at from a distance. That small column of smoke rising steady and unhurried against the wide sky, and Thomas watched it all the way home.